Caroline Lucas, the UN has passed a resolution which paves the way for action, and our major allies, including the French, would like us to join them. Why shouldn't we?
I think at the minute we shouldn't, because there hasn't been a strong enough case made by the Prime Minister that our getting involved would actually either make Britain safer or indeed bring more likelihood of peace in the region. I think looking at the evidence given to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, it's really clear that nearly all of the evidence that they received was that if we get involved in this, it actually is going to feed the ISIS narrative, which they would love to be able to present them as the kind of guardians of Islam against the Crusaders from the West. If we play into that, recruits will grow. And that's already been happening. Let's look at what's happened from the bombing so far.
Were you against the bombing in Iraq?
Just now?
Yeah. 2014.
Yes, I was. I don't believe that.
So you don't think we should be involved at all, militarily?
I don't think we should be involved at all militarily. And what I was going to go on to say was that if you look at the evidence of the bombing that's taken part so far over Iraq, then basically over the last year, we've seen more recruits, double the number of recruits have actually gone to ISIS since that bombing has started, because we are feeding that narrative about this being an issue.
But they've also lost ground. They've lost major ground as well.
Well, that is disputed. They have lost ground, but a lot of it is deserts, and they've also gained places like Palmyra. So let's look at whether or not the bombing that's taken part...
Palmyra's in Syria.
Yes, but I'm talking about the bombing that the US has been doing in Syria. The US has been bombing Syria for a long time, and it hasn't driven ISIS back. It does risk the narrative that more recruits will come to ISIS. That's already happening. And I want to say as well that by saying that we don't want to drop bombs doesn't mean we don't want action. Of course we want action, and there's plenty we could be doing, putting pressure on Turkey, for example, to seal the border, to stop the weapons and stopping the oil sales that is feeding ISIS.
What does putting pressure mean?
It means doing what's happening already over the refugee crisis, speaking to them, putting pressure on them, looking at, when it comes to Saudi in particular, I think we could be looking at all kinds of financial measures that we've been happy enough to take against Russia over the Ukraine, and yet we're not taking those measures against Syria, against Saudi Arabia rather,
You want us to take financial sanctions against Saudi Arabia?
I think that would be something we should certainly consider, yes, because at the moment we know that Saudi isn't clamping down on the families and others who are still channeling finance towards ISIS. So at the minute, we always look at the military response as the fastest and easiest thing to do, and we don't necessarily look at other ways in which ISIS is being fed. It's being fed by finance, it's being fed by weapons, it's being fed by the chaos of the Syrian civil war, and all of those need to be addressed as well.
Well, the Syrian economy has effectively collapsed into a wartime economy funded by arms smuggling, oil smuggling, people smuggling, and the extortion of families of the 60,000 disappeared people. So we have effectively almost got a failed state in Syria. Caroline talks about sealing the border with Turkey. The last thing that the humanitarian people working in Turkey want to see is borders sealed, because of course we have huge flows of people out of Syria. Over half of the population is now displaced. So we've got 4 million people who've left the country, 6 million people homeless within the country. It is in an absolutely desperate state. And as long as we leave Islamic State there, they now have 30,000 fighters from over 100 different countries.
But
if
Mary,
we are prepared to...
point,
let me finish my point. If we are prepared to just allow them to continue to regroup and recruit in Raqqa, then we will never have peace in Iraq, and we will never have peace in Syria.
Mary, on that point, there were 15,000 recruits last year from 80 countries. My point is that bombing precisely has led to the increase of recruits to now being double that, 30,000 from 100 countries. What we are doing here is actually encouraging more people to see this as a fight between the West and Islam, and they are therefore actually increasing the number of recruits going to that area. Surely, before we start getting involved in more bombing, we should look at the effect that the bombing has had so far, and it has not had positive impacts.
You posit the effect that the bombing has had this effect. I would argue that the effect of having a failed state in Syria, the effect that they are the only people seen to be standing up to Assad in his own country, means that, in effect, there were 200,000 Free Syrian Army fighters two years ago. Now they're down to about 70,000. A lot of people, there's a lot of fluidity in Syria, but the problem we've got is, as long as Assad is there, that people, are either co-opted into fighting for them at the point of a gun. So it's their propaganda as well.
Let's go back to the 70,000 ground troops. Where are these phantom 70,000 ground troops? who are going to support us, because we know that bombing on its own, everybody agrees that bombing on its own won't work, that we need ground forces. David Cameron came to the Commons and claimed there were 70,000 ground forces who were not pro-Assad and who were not extremist. And that figure has been absolutely hammered by all of the experts. I mean, Robert Fisk in yesterday's Independent newspaper calling it a complete phantom, a complete mockery to suggest those ground troops are there. There are 100 different groups within them.
This is why the peace process is so important, because as the Free Syrian Army is murdered by Assad, there will be fewer and fewer people able to protect their towns and able to stand up for him. So we need a multilateral peace framework in order for the people of Syria to take back their country from the jihadis. And the idea that we just let them get on with it.
We're not letting them get on with it. That is such
we found mass graves. They were 70 miles away from Baghdad in May of this year, Islamic State, marching on Baghdad. And, you know, the idea that somehow... No, let me finish. You've had your say, I want to have mine. And the idea that somehow just allowing it all to continue... These are people who throw
just allowing it to continue,
gay men
Mary.
off. We have allowed it to continue for 3 years in Syria. They throw gay men off buildings, they enslave children as young as 5 into sexual slavery, and they murder women of our age who are too old to be sold.
So much of the evidence...
That is not
Let me
acceptable.
say something now, because you have talked a lot. So many of the people giving evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee made the point that actually by our getting involved in the bombing, we reduce our capacity to be able to play a big role in the diplomatic efforts. Many of those experts said that Britain is well placed, because we're not currently bombing Syria, to play a real role in those Vienna peace talks, and that will be undermined if we start becoming part of the effort fighting against that.
I mean,
I don't know that, but we're looking at expert
You don't know that, and they don't know. They don't know it
but
either.
If you have a House of Commons inquiry,
it's just a
when
piece
you
of
listen to a lot of
it's
experts,
just a piece of commentary. It's not a basis of a policy.
But
And
surely one should look
have
at those experts in the area. The Foreign Affairs Committee assembled those experts. They heard it. A cross-party Foreign Affairs Committee came to the conclusion that the case had not been made for bombing.
Well, the chairman of that select committee has now changed his mind. So, you know, he's obviously...
What I don't understand is that you put this great faith in the peace process, both of you bigging up, actually, the evidence is pretty slight, actually, for it. But at the same time, you want to use the non-IS terrorist, anti-Assad people. But any peace process will involve Assad and the Russians. So I don't understand how you can keep the anti-Assad freedom fighters happy and still have to deal with Mr. Assad and the Russians. I mean, they're both on the opposite sides.
We have to give Syria back its territorial integrity, which it no longer has. It effectively, in the east, is no longer a functioning state. That's the first thing. The second thing is we have to fight the terrorist factory, the jihadi factory, which eastern Syria has become. And we've foiled 7 terror attacks in our own country since the start of this year. And we've had 30 British holidaymakers murdered on that beach in Tunisia.
And let's make sure that we don't make things worse, Mary. Nobody is denying that ISIS does terrible things. What we are challenging is whether or not the UK getting involved in military strikes is going to be able to...
We need to move on. You both had a good chance to lay out your arguments now.